Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Tonight's topic is containing how listening can lead to healing. It's probably one of my favorite topics to teach, and also has some complexity. So I'm going to try to boil it down to you because the beauty of it is quite amazing. So we'll get to that in just a second. Before I jump into the content, I just want to remind you of a service that we offer here at Evoke. We offer virtual coaching. So if you're looking for an attachment-based therapist or coach, Evoke is providing that now. So you can do it anywhere in the country. You can talk to our staff and find out about more about who's a good fit. Contact coaching at evoketherapy.com. Like I say, in terms of what you can do to make a difference in your life and your parenting and your couples, I have the opinion that the most important work, the first work, is to know yourself, to know thyself, to do your own work. And the research is overwhelmingly clear that the foundation of healthy attachment, of healthy parenting, of even resilient children is a parent who's done their own work, who's unwound their own trauma, their own history. You don't have to have a good childhood or a bad childhood. You just have to have had a childhood. And in fact, having a good childhood, having little to no trauma is actually not a good predictor of your ability to provide these kinds of things. So therapy is, in my opinion, the most important thing. It's virtually the answer that I give to almost every question, which is do your own work first. So just want to share that with you tonight. Tonight I'm going to use the word containing, and I want you can think of it in terms of holding space for somebody, of sitting quietly and patiently. I asked my therapist when I was first learning about this topic, and by the way, this was not a big discussion in my 5 years of graduate school, which to me is amazing and profound. And frankly, it's a great disservice to therapists. You don't historically, at least when I was going to school, and even even the therapists that I train today, they don't get a lot of it because when you realize what heals people, and primarily you learn that by doing your own healing, then you want to teach it to other people. And so many professors who are teaching modern theories and ideas don't understand that containing, holding space is the glue that holds everything together in therapy. Containing is a way of responding to a client. A container is capable. They have boundaries. They respond with curiosity, compassion, non-judgment. You might even call it a neutrality. They're a safe place for somebody to explore their life. I had a client ask me this week in psychotherapy during virtual coaching. Actually, they asked me the question. They said, I'm not sure if I should ask this question, if it's appropriate. I said, the wonderful thing about psychotherapy is you don't have to decide what's appropriate. I can, you can ask what you want to, and I can respond. This is a place where you don't have to get it right. In fact, so much of psychotherapy is about unlearning or deprogramming or killing old ideas or beliefs, patterns, ways of seeing that you don't even know to expect. You don't know that's the way that change happens, is by exploring yourself in a safe place where there's no shame, there's no guilt, and there's no judgment. But as I'm going to talk about several times tonight, we look at treatment, right? We look at what works, what heals in treatment, and we can extrapolate or go backwards and understand this is also the same thing as prevention. So when I talk about psychotherapy or therapy and I talk about parenting, there's so much more in common with those two roles than there are differences. So I'm going to start off with how human beings are built, brick by brick. A child learns about themselves as they look into the face of their parents and others in their earliest contexts. How we parents think and feel about our children becomes the inner voice for the child. Notice this is not just what we say, but what we feel. The unconsciousness of the big people around the child speaks directly to the unconscious of the child, and the child develops their identity based on that energy or that feedback. This is how skills fall short. Containing is built containing is built on the foundation of all of the work that we do. It's a central cornerstone. Pick your metaphor. It's critical. I don't care if you're doing DBT or CBT or any of the new and modern therapies. How the therapist feels about you, replicating that parent-child relationship is the glue. It makes all the difference. And I'm going to talk about tonight about why that's so counterintuitive to us. I will tell you this, and you may or may not be surprised. Part of my job is training and teaching therapists. I spend a lot of time training and teaching therapists. And while they might agree with me that clients need a safe container, a safe place, when we actually try to implement it, when we do role plays, when I'm observing them in therapy, it escapes them because the wiring, the programming is so hardwired in us that we think that the way that people change or improve, I guess, is the word, or evolve or grow, is by a kick in the butt, a kick in the pants. That we have to be sure to be a person that makes them accountable, that challenges them, that confronts them. I even see a lot of therapists today, a lot of therapists that have great reputations in the field, almost wear their ability to confront people as a badge of courage. I was one time co-hosting an event with another therapist, and with pride to a very large audience who came to hear us speak. My co-presenter, she told them that she just tells people the way that it is. And she took pride in the fact that many of the people that she talks to don't come back to her in therapy. And she might even do that on the initial call or the front end. What's the value in that? Any first year graduate student can point out somebody's weaknesses or pathology. That's easy to do. But really, what you're trying to do, it's like I was teaching the staff a couple of years ago. I was talking about how confrontation is not what we're built on. We're built on gentle invitation, exploring ideas, coming up with thoughts and ideas, offering perspective, all built upon that foundation of containing, of holding space for somebody. And I used, for example, I said to them, for example, you don't tell kids you're justifying, you're rationalizing. There's no talent or insight in that. But what you do is you try to show up in a way that the defense, the justification, the rationalization, the denial, that the defense isn't necessary because they don't feel threatened. And that takes time. Like I mentioned just the other night, that's why the greatest barrier to successful therapy, in my experience, is that its pace is so slow. And we're so accustomed to wanting things quick and fast and dirty. But it takes time. We are wounded in relationships and we are healed in relationships. And psychotherapy becomes a reparative experience. We walk in there, and if we're lucky and we have an adequate therapist, that's the term I use for what most people would call a good therapist. If we have an adequate therapist, we experience ourselves differently. What was once the truth is now um, just somebody else's truth. It was we learned about all of our contexts and how there was no perfect context, no right context, and we do that in a safe place. We do that by challenging old ways of thinking, not by having paid parents to sit across from us to give us lectures or advice. Like I tell to my 15-year-old daughter, if your therapist gives you advice, unsolicited advice or advice that you're not looking for, tell your therapist you already have parents for that. You don't need any more. Containing is the safety. Like I said, that we can learn from treatment, we can extrapolate or expand that to understand that's prevention, that's healthy development. And in attachment-based therapy, which understands that, think psychodynamic. If attachment-based therapy sounds new to you or something you haven't heard, you can think of psychodynamic or analytic therapy, which in the world there's a lot of misconceptions about it because people think that the therapy that Freud and Jung invented years ago was the way it's being implemented today, and we've had a lot of advancement since then. But they built the foundation. So we take their ideas to understand that the goal in attachment-based therapy is for the client to re-experience themselves in the presence of an empathic, warm, and neutral other. Therapy then becomes the childhood we never had, and the parent that we never had. And there's no indictment on you with this. Every parent falls short. Every parent has limitations. There is no perfect parent. And therapy is a place that we can go again and experience ourselves differently. That's why I said just the other night, when people talk about experiential therapy, and they're usually talking about therapy where you use body and movements and other sensations and activities besides just talk and listening. And of course, that is the definition of experiential therapy. But the very act of going in and telling a therapist the truth about yourself and taking the risk that they will respond with the same reactions that the big people in your life have responded to, with the people growing up or when you grew up, the people that were around you, your teachers, your parents, the society. That's the risk. That's the experience. And if you get lucky and they respond differently, all of a sudden everything opens up for you. Remember, the book, the play, the musical, the movie Les Miserables, written by Victor Hugo, the book was. Remember the scene where Jean Valjean, the prisoner, after serving his term, is goes to steal, knocks the bishop over the head. I think it was a bishop. Knocks the bishop over the head and steals his silver. And when he's brought back by the police later that day, the bishop's still wearing the wound from his earlier attack. He says to Jean Valjean, "You silly, you left the most important part. You left the candlesticks. They're the richest part of my treasure." And he gave Jean Valjean the candlesticks. The police, of course, apologized for misunderstanding the context and walked away. And then the bishop invited Jean Valjean to do something different. Now, that's a movie or a musical or a book. I know it's not a real life, but what Victor Hugo is trying to demonstrate is that's how people change. But we don't believe it. We believe that shame and guilt and punishment and threat is the way that we're motivated. That's what we were taught. And in a way, those behaviors, right? The being tough on somebody, telling them the way it is, confronting them, it can get short-term results, and that's why it's so confusing. And compassion and containing and being a safe, non-judgmental, neutral other is so scary is because that means that the person is going to live a very messy life. If they're going to find out who they are in that safe context, they're going to make mistakes. They're going to choose the wrong thing. And at least, folks, at least they're going to choose things that you think are wrong that aren't. My 15-year-old daughter, I believe partly as a result of her being with a therapist that serves her in this way, that she really likes and enjoys the therapy with. She said to us at dinner last night after we finished, she said, I realized this week that we're all doing this for the first time. Parents and children are all doing this for the first time. The fact of the matter is, I don't know what my daughter is going to become. My daughter lives, I didn't grow up in the world that she grew up in. I didn't grow up in the house that she grew up in. I didn't grow up in the society that she grew up in. Think about how much more self-awareness and emotional intelligence you have compared to your parents. Think about that. Think about the distance between your emotional intelligence and your parents' emotional intelligence. It will be the same for you and your children, and it will be the same for their children and their children and their children and their children and so on. So our job is to maintain boundaries, to become who we are, to get clear about ourselves, to work on our own life, to make that the project. And in so doing, all of this work, we become more capable containers, listeners, holding neutral space. I say to new clients sometimes that I aspire to having very little opinion about my children and what they do. Obviously, I have to deal with boundaries and consequences at time. That's a part of my responsibility also. But in terms of their mistakes, their missteps, their detours, their setbacks, isn't that the way that we learn? And if a child comes to you and tells you something about themselves and your response, this is the simplest visceral way that I can teach this. If a child comes to you and tells you something, And your response is to gasp in anxiety and fear, something along that line. The first thing the child knows is that you're not safe. When the child comes to you sharing a feeling and you try to fix it, the first thing they know is you're not safe. When you try to solve it, when you try to make it better, when you try to talk them out of their feeling, all of those are evidence of the fact that you're lacking capacity at the time. And that is human. That doesn't mean that you've failed. Every parent will reach their limits. Every child will find the limits of their parents' capacity. And so what do you do about that? Being the human parent that you are, you do your work. And over time, and those of you have been doing it for a while, you know this, your capacity expands. I have 4 children. My oldest is 30 in a week, 2 weeks, week and a half. My youngest is 15 and I have 2 in between. I am a completely different person than I was when I was raising my first child. And I'm sure if I were continuing to raise children, and I am not continuing to raise children, but if I were, that would continue, right? Till the day that I passed on. So we look at treatment and prevention in very much the same way. I wrote this in The Journey of the Heroic Parent, speaking about containing. Therapists are not experts on your life. Again, I'm purposely talking about therapy and parenting in somewhat of a synonymous way tonight in terms of this skill, this principle containing. Therapists are not experts on your life. Rather, their expertise is in creating the container or experience in which you can discover your truth. An effective container is a place where one feels safe to explore all the parts of themselves free from judgments. In this way, the container is the mind of the therapist. Ideally, for children, it is the mind of the parent. If you are constantly worried about your child, if you think that they're screwing up their life, they will think something's wrong with them. Our frustration, our anger, our disappointment, our anxiety is translated from us into our children as something is wrong with me. And then they spend their whole lives trying not to be that wrong thing, trying not to be, probably, most likely, themselves. And they spend a life at war with themselves, using all of that energy to try to improve, to try to get better, to try to heal, to try to be success, to come out on top, to win, to be good. And again, I say that, and I'm sure there's plenty of people listening. They're like, those don't sound like bad things. But psychotherapy thinks that the goal is to be whole, to be who you are. And psychotherapy knows that when you become who you are full of love, compassion, empathy, morals, sensitivities, kindness, generosity. When you're at peace with yourself, those things naturally flow. But when you're at war with yourself, you're too busy defending yourself. Like I've said many, many times on these broadcasts, if I had escaped childhood, knowing that I was okay, I could have spent my life giving away my gifts. But I didn't escape childhood knowing that I was okay. I thought I was lazy. About 15 years ago, I was talking to my wife about being lazy. She said, "Wait a second. You have a PhD. You started a business. At the time that we talked, you've completed marathons, later to complete Ironman triathlons." She said, "I don't know where this idea about being lazy," and I really realized it was ingrained in me from my parents, from my grandfather, actually. I believe that about myself because that's what they believed about me. So I assumed it was true, and I assumed it was about me. Here's the biggest secret, guys, that I don't think I could ever truly say this. This is the part of the broadcast that you're going to hear something that people don't talk about. Some do, of course. But the secret, what is the secret to containing? The secret is doing your own work and grappling with your shame and guilt. See, if I take care of myself, if I can fill my belly up spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, then I have more to give. And psychotherapy understands, psychology understands that people do bad things to other people because they're wounded, because they don't feel safe, because they're hurting, because they're unhealed. So if you want to do your work, you have to bypass and grapple with the guilt to take care of yourself. You have to take a time out. You have to walk away. You have to spend time doing things that are selfish for you. You have to let other people down. You have to fail other people. You have to disappoint other people. But because we were conditioned as children to be good people, we thought that was the goal. So we can't watch a ball game or go out with friends or say no to somebody. We can't do that because guilt and shame won't let us. When our children are upset and crying, we can't say no because guilt and shame won't let us. And so we end up angry and resentful and with a lack of capacity to contain people. My wife says it this way. She says, if you don't feed yourself, if you come to the relationship hungry, you will eat the other person. That's the secret. Think about the Dalai Lama, just as a thought experiment. Even if you're not Buddhist, just imagine an enlightened person, a person whose life and mission is committed to the kind of energy that I'm talking about tonight. Compassion, non-judgment, kindness, love. Think about somebody like that. You know why they're so good at that? Because they do not compromise self-care. The Dalai Lama is 10 times better at self-care than you are and I am. A Buddhist monk who can show patience, they leave everybody for months on end to take care of themselves. So when somebody says, I'm trying to be the Buddha, what I say to them is, good. You can learn to be selfish just like he is. The Buddha sat under the tree forever, helping nobody, doing nothing for anybody until he was ready. But we skip that part. We think we're supposed to be like Gandhi or the Buddha or Yoda or pick your hero. But the foundation that they have that we don't is that they don't compromise their boundaries. They take care of themselves. They say no. They know themselves well enough. They're not struggling with their ego. They're not trying to be good because they already are good and they already know they're good. That's the magic. That's the counterintuitiveness, the paradox. When you already know that you're good, you don't have to prove it to anybody. You can listen better. If you know, I don't like the word good, I like the word okay. If you know that you're okay and somebody tells you that you're a buffoon, you will connect and listen to them. You will hear that as an expression of their pain, of their hurt, of their fear. But if you don't know that you're okay and somebody calls you a buffoon, you will defend it. You will counterattack. You will cut them off. You will punish them. You will lecture. You will debate. You will argue. The secret, mom and dad, husband and wife, brother and sister, friend, the secret is self-care, self-work, getting rid of shame and guilt. But again, we've been taught that shame and guilt are important. We're learning a little bit more in our culture that shame is toxic, but we've been taught that guilt is morality. Guilt is just as toxic, and I say even more insidious than shame because it's I have therapists for years. I couldn't convince therapists to stop teaching guilt as some kind of virtue. And I finally said to them after years of training, I said, I'm done debating. I'm done arguing my point. In this program, we will not do that because we know something about that. You learn to own and feel yourself. But again, if you're afraid and trying to be good, owning your stuff is vulnerable. Because then you're the problem. You're the issue. It's your feeling. It's your responsibility. And we don't want it to be ours. You see how it's all shame and guilt? All of it. In psychotherapy is the same thing as therapy. In psychotherapy, the transformation is that guilt and shame lose their grip year after year after year. And once we get past the terror that when we let go of our guilt and shame, that we won't become hedonistic, self-serving monsters, which we've been taught that we would if we don't feel guilty. Once we get past that, all we want to do is give that same love to everybody else. The answer is not. I want to be clear. If your child says, I'm cutting on myself, if your child says, I'm doing heroin, if your child says, I just had promiscuous sex, pick the issue. You're going to have feelings. And I am not telling you to not feel them. I cannot emphasize that enough because people always hear me saying, don't feel. It's just your responsibility to take that feeling and talk to somebody else about it, to take the responsibility. Because if we go to the child or the spouse or the friend, essentially, most commonly, we're saying to them implicitly, your behavior caused this feeling. Therefore, the solution to this hurt, to this pain, to this sadness, to this grief, to this frustration, this anger is you changing. I wrote in my second book, I'm almost at the point where I tell parents to not share their feelings with their children. And the reason I said that is because most people communicate to other people implicitly that they are responsible for other people's feelings. The most common parenting technique of the untrained, I would argue, well-intentioned parent. It was at least my approach. It's mostly the approach with almost every parent that I've ever dealt with in my life is they tell their children when they're sad or hurt or scared or anxious or angry or disappointed. And that is supposed to be evidence to the child, like I mentioned earlier, that the child is doing something well or doing something poorly, doing something right or wrong. So we actually explicitly teach our children that our feelings are their responsibility. And this work of healing, this work of psychotherapy, this work of parenting, um, it's to take responsibility for our own happiness. Even in my marriage, my wife and I talk about this all the time. About 13 years ago, we came to this point where both of us decided through a lot of work and pain, that her happiness is not my responsibility. And my happiness, her happiness is not my responsibility, and my happiness is not her responsibility. My happiness is my responsibility. Hers is hers. And if we're going to have the most successful marriage that we can have, we're going to make that project of ours our priority and come to the relationship happy. And decide, like I wrote about in the Audacity to Be You, decide to make our individual journeys a shared journey. But when we come to our children, I mean, parents, I talk about this. One of my favorite adages to debunk is the myth that you're only as happy as your least happy child. That's insane. That's the disease. And yet there's some kind of aspiration in our culture that that's a good thing, that that's love. That's all that says to the child is they're responsible for you. That's the cause of most pathology, folks, because it blocks the person becoming who they are naturally. So you take your feelings and you go to your Al-Anon sponsor. You go to your Codependence Anonymous sponsor or your AA sponsor or your therapist or your mentor or your support group, and you tell it there. People say to me, well, I don't like to go to Al-Anon because everybody is there is just complaining. And my point is, yeah, that's the goal. That's the place. Dump it there so you're not dumping it on your kid. Because if you don't burn that fuel, it will leak onto your children, onto your family, onto your spouse. We're afraid. We're afraid that the method that I'm teaching you tonight, I'm sure even those of you that are fairly far along the path are afraid that it's not enough. That it won't have the intended effect of healing and attachment and esteem and resilience. We really think that. I've dealt with therapists who are well known in the treatment field. And they told me if I don't have guilt, I won't do anything. I won't do the right things. And I've said to them, I understand. That's what I was taught too. And it took me years in therapy to realize guilt was the thing that was destroying me, not saving me. and it's a work in progress. And so we think that we need the guilt and the shame and the anger and the frustration and the feelings and the, I don't know where it was I just saw the other day. Oh, I know what it was. I was reading a movie script to give some notes back to the author of a movie that's based on therapy. And one of the assignments in the therapy, it's a movie based on therapy, was for the parents to write a letter to the addict saying, "This is how your addiction affected me." And I'm thinking, that's the problem in the first place. That's why the child, in this case, in this story that I was reading, that's why they're in treatment, because they're overwhelmed with the guilt and shame that they're causing the person who loves them the most to suffer. So they must be bad. And then they medicate themselves to relieve themselves from that critical inner voice that tells them that they're bad. It's the only time they have relief. And that behavior becomes a pattern, a compulsion, an addiction over time. So when I wrote my notes, I tweaked it a little bit, kind of the evoke hopes and intentions letter that we switched several years ago. And I said, how about you just write about how you see their addiction of impacting their life and how much you love them. And the fear and the anxiety and the hurt, lightly. Lay that on there lightly. Hold that lightly. Because too much of that will be the poison, not the cure. It's really the difference between having boundaries and manipulating others. We either do the work of boundaries and that does the teaching, or we try to get other people to change. Right? Most of us will try to coerce, to threaten, to intimidate, to scare, to evoke pity, to get somebody to have an emotional experience that they'll change their behavior. Because boundaries are harder, because of guilt. It's that. And I want you to hear this, folks. When I say it that matter of fact, and it is that matter of fact, I haven't mastered it. I still go to psychotherapy. I still struggle with it. I still have setbacks. I will violate the core principles of this broadcast later this evening with my family once, and tomorrow several times, and the day after that. It's a work in progress. But I know what my project is, and that's where the hope comes from. I know what my wound is to some degree, and that's where the hope comes from. I know that by spending time with my therapist once a week for an hour, I'm in the practice of looking myself in a safe place. Some of you that might be new, others of the veterans of this broadcast will have heard this story a million times. But when I said to my therapist in 2010, when I stuttered and stumbled to try to confess something I'd done or said or believed or felt, she interrupted me gently and playfully and said, "Brad, I don't." And she was very serious, but it was a playful way of saying it. She said, "If you came in here telling me that you were having sex with a chicken, I would assume you have a good reason, and I would want to understand why." And that was the moment when I realized I had never been in a room like that in my life. Not with my mother, not with my wife, not with friends. I can barely tell people what kind of food I like without them trying to talk me into it. I think the chicken sex would be a no go for most of them. But what she taught me that day was, "Y- you're doing it for a reason." That's what Khalil Gibran, the prophet, in the book, the prophet talks about. You are good when you're good, but you're not evil when you're not good. You're just hungry, starving, tormented by your own thirst, afraid, scared. Evil is a consequence of trauma, not the cause. It's not the origin. Hurt people hurt people. There's a great 7 or 8 minute small little video where a woman goes into prisons teaching about shame. And the convicts are learning for the first time about their shame. And the most beautiful moment is a couple of convicts, a couple of prisoners. One of them says, "I've never heard anybody talk about this, and I'm starting to realize that my parents were traumatized. I was raised by traumatized people. I was traumatized by people who were traumatized." I love how psychology and psychotherapy switches the moral landscape from bad and good to healed or wounded. Those have such less stigmas. They evoke less defensiveness. They promote growth. Being told that you're bad? Well, you know what that's like. You know what it's like to be told that you're bad. You know what your response is. You defend it. You don't experience it as a defense. What you experience it as is the person doesn't quite understand me. And that's what people feel when they're in an experience where they're not being contained. They feel misunderstood, not seen. The difference between the Buddha and you, the difference between the Buddha and me, first and foremost, is he does better self-care than us, or he did better self-care than us. So from beyond, this is goes back a ways to the 1950s, where somebody's talking from the analytic perspective about containing. So I have a couple of slides on that I want to read to you so you get a little bit of the clinical language along with my storytelling and my examples. Beyond said, an example might be a mother who responds to an infant's distress, but responds with exasperation rather than with a soothing attitude, or a therapist who responds to a patient's rage with defensive measures rather than acceptance and a genuine curiosity to better comprehend the response. From the infant's point of view, she could have taken into her and thus experienced the child's fear of the child's distress. It was this fear that the child could not contain for himself. An understanding parent is able to experience the feeling of dread that this baby was striving to deal with by projective identification and yet retain a balanced outlook. So you take in from the other person their distress, their chicken sex story, their self-harm, their suicidal ideation. You take it in, you metabolize it with the resources that you have as a big person who's done their work, and you reflect back a sense of okayness and safety. And the modification that happens is minuscule and tiny. When somebody tells me they're suicidal, I tell them, first of all, I can relate. I think on Tuesday night, I told the story of Eros and Psyche and Aphrodite, where um, each time that Psyche was presented with a challenge to win the love of her love, to win her lover's hand back, every time she experienced this challenge that was overwhelming, she had the urge to kill herself. That's our instinct. We withdraw. Adam and Eve covered themselves up, hid from God. That's the shame. That's the disappearing. That's the death. But what we know about in psychotherapy is that if we learn to kill parts of us, we don't have to kill the whole self. If we learn to transform, if we learn to give up old versions of ourselves. The reason I'm telling you this story is because that's how I respond with that wisdom, with that experience, and that contact that I had in my own therapist, in my own therapy. And when I respond calmly, I have seen, not all the time, and it's not a one time, one moment fix, but over time I've seen with many young people, me respond to things that their parents responded to with disgust and disappointment and anger and fear. And in my calm response, I have seen them relax. I've seen them sort themselves out. I've seen them I've seen their their psychopathology diminish in the moment. You want to be your child's call when they call you in a crisis. But if your anxiety is unmanaged, you're not regulating yourself, you're not expanding and becoming a more capable container, they won't call you. They'll go to the friend that you don't want them to go to get advice and counsel. We expand, we grow, we become larger, we become more capable. And that capacity, by the way, parallels our improvement and clarity with our boundaries and our self-care. We know that when we are at our wits' end, that it is about us. We own that. I yelled at you because I was triggered. Yes, you did something. It's the same in the Four Agreements. When Don Miguel Ruiz talks about don't take anything personally. I don't like the language because it sounds like a should, like an edict or something. But this is what he's talking about. It's not about you. And emotional growth and emotional maturity is understanding that other people's reactions to you tell you more about them than they do about you. That's what growth and capacity do. More from beyond. When the contain has a resonant impact on the container, and the response of the container is to empathically accept the contained. I know it sounds super technical, and subtly modify it by the use of greater resources than the container, i.e., metabolize the contained. So you take in a child's distress, you metabolize it through your parent, your big person work, your filter, your wisdom, your self-knowledge, and you reflect back. A client comes to me and says, I yelled at my kid today. And I say, instead of saying, well, you shouldn't do that and that's harmful, I say, it's really hard not to. I do it all the time. It's my go-to. I stumble also. And you were scared. That's what it sounds like. You see how I've metabolized it? I've joined with it. I've de-shamed it. I'm sort of neutral about it. I've renamed it a fear, for example. That's how healing happens. But we're so, with our children, we're holding on so tightly. We're so scared. We're sure, just like Darth Vader was, that the solution to pain is control. That's what George Lucas was trying to teach us in the story. There are two ways to regard the universe. One is through fear and anger, and the other is through love and a capacity to suffer empathically, to grieve. In this situation, speaking of the contained by beyond, the contained is more or less fully felt and understood by the container. At the same time, the container can rely on additional resources to feed back to the container a wider sense of the contained experience, like I did with the parent who confessed to yelling at their child. You see? And of course, all of us will fail at it. All parents fail, all therapists fail at being containers at time. Some more, some less. And failing, Hinzelwood says, and failing, the parent becomes a container that is either too rigid or too fragile. A rigid mother takes in, as Beyond describes, and utters formal responses without a real understanding of the infant's distress. They look like cut off, disengaged. Those are the modern family systems terms that are used. A fragile parent will, when confronted by her distressed baby, go to pieces in panic. In either case, the infant receives back its own projection with the implicit message that, after all, as it feared, its state of mind is not tolerable. It suffers, in Beyond's terms, a nameless dread, that is, a state of mind that is not thinkable. When you become too much for the parent, it's terrifying on an unconscious psychological level. When mom and dad are angry or anxious, it's terrifying. You don't call it that. They don't call it that. Nobody identifies that, but that's the psychology. That's what makes Evoke different than other therapeutic programs who provide treatment for families and young people, is we understand this is how human beings are developed, how they're built, how they grow. That's why the attachment-based folks know, like Daniel Siegel, perhaps the most popular attachment-based teacher these days, is that all of the important work in families is really resting on the amount of work that the parents have done. I've said that, I was thinking about this today. For years, I would do these broadcasts, and if you listen to the broadcast 15 years ago, I'm a different person. I was younger. I was new. This was all new. There are bits and pieces of what I teach today, but today it's more developed. But at any rate, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about how I had responses back in those days from parents saying, I feel so bad after I listened to you talk, which of course was befuddling to me. It was not my intention. And then as I started to share more of my own humanity, I got more responses like, thank you. At first, I did hear from people, and I've heard from a handful of people over the years saying, why should I trust you if you make the same mistakes or worse than I do sometimes? And my response now is, good, don't trust me. I'm glad. Don't look up to me. Don't think that I have it figured out, because I don't. And second of all, those early complaints that they felt bad, I was just bumping up against people's shame. And the fact of the matter is, Like Jung says, if parents don't understand that they're the primary source of their child's neuroses, nothing will change. But what doesn't have to happen with that realization, that awakening, is for us to feel bad about ourselves and horrible. In fact, as I mention all the time, that bad feeling, that horrible feeling that comes when you realize that you've dented your child, that's the problem in the first place. That's your trauma. So we grapple with shame, we grapple with guilt, we learn to let go of it little by little over the period of our entire lives. And as we do that, we become a much the most enlightened version of ourselves, the kindest, most generous, most clear, most boundaried, most capable. My daughter, who's 15, has a very dented parent, but I will tell you, she also has a parent that has more capacity than my oldest had, that's for sure. And I can see the difference. So for parents, what gets in the way? It's the ego, the need to be good. That's it. The idea that that's the goal for anybody anyway. Because we don't have boundaries, because we were taught that we were responsible for how our parents felt, because they told us that. We take that template, that model of human relatedness to our children, so we over-identify them. We don't know where they stop and we start. When they say something, we feel like it's about us because we haven't done the work to discover who we are, and we're relying on them. Sometimes it's low pain tolerance. It's the inability for us to tolerate empathic misery. Every human being has a nervous system, and everybody's nervous system is sensitive at various levels. Some less so, and some much more so. And if you have a sensitive nervous system, which I think probably most of the people that I'm talking to, have a sensitive nervous system, you're gonna be challenged by watching somebody that you care about hurt and in pain. We think that the solution to regulating our nervous system, to us feeling a sense of safety and okay, is by controlling others. That's a mistake that we make, a barrier to containing. The fact of the matter is, you're wired as a parent and socialized to be the protector of your child, which makes a lot of sense when they're infants and helpless. But of course, the course of the development of parenting is to gradually let go. We have distorted ideas about what children need and what the goal in parenting is. That's the basic thing. We don't know that the goal is to be a human and to be who we are. We think the goal is to be a good person. And good people are the hardest people to work with and the hardest parents to have. And I mean good people in quotes. People who make it their goal to prove to the world that they're good and worthy. Those people take and take and take and take because they're empty, because they're starving to death. But if they do their own healing, if they fill up their bellies, then they can be available to love others. We don't get to be the expert. We don't get to be right. We don't get to win. We just get to be ourselves. My adage, you don't get to win, you get to choose how to lose. Wise, mature people understand that. Understand that if you have a cutoff or too rigid of a response, too distant of a response, or too enmeshed of a response, it's just stylistically different. It has a style, an impact on a child that is stylistic, but it's essentially the same thing. It's a lack of containing, and the child ends up feeling something's wrong with them at a core level. Watch for your control triggers to fix, to alleviate, to solve, to dismiss or discount, to change, to defend yourself, etc. Learn to mentalize, which is when parents say to me, I don't understand my child, that's a fair thing to say. Sometimes these child do a great job about trying not to be understood. You see, that's the purpose of the symptom in the first place. The purpose of the mental illness symptom is to distract the individual and everyone around them from the authentic suffering and pain that needs to be felt. So parents will tell me I don't get my kid, and I'll do my best to give my best hypothesis interpretation about what I see going on. But essentially, my message is it's your job to understand them, and you will understand them just about the same time you understand more of yourself, because you're more like your child than you can possibly comprehend. Self-care is not self-love and self-improvement. This is not about getting better. This is about being understood. This is about being resonated with. This is about being heard, being validated, feeling connection. That causes the improvement. It's not about you should do this. You should contain. Mom and dad, I'm not telling you any shoulds today. I'm telling you just how it works. I had a good friend and a good therapist, a female therapist, tell me that I just didn't understand women and mothers and the challenge they had. And to some degree, she's right, for sure. But when I was telling my therapist about this work that I do and how my colleague interpreted what I was saying as unempathic or insensitive or judgmental, she said, what your colleague, this is what my therapist said, she said, what your colleague doesn't understand is you're not indicting anybody, you're just describing what happens. And most people, they want to, what do I do? Tell me what to do. Tell me the behaviors. Tell me the action steps. That's not what we do at all. We talk about personal transformation and awareness and growing and healing. And out of that naturally comes the expression that is necessary. That's different. I don't say break up with your boyfriend or break up with your girlfriend. I say you'll figure it out. Just like I did, mostly through my mistakes. Mostly through my mistakes. That's how people grow. The task is to tolerate their rotten self, our rotten self, and their rotten self, and still hold boundaries. And most people think that they're mutually exclusive. Speaking about errors that we make in containing, acting on a feeling from your child as if it's yours, as if it's about you, instead of trying to understand the feeling in the child, is an error. And we all do this at times. I've taught you this before, but I want to take a moment. Projective identification is not projection. Everybody kind of knows what projection is, right? You take parts of yourself that you don't identify with because either they're unacceptable in your background or because you're not supposed to think good about you. It could be positive or negative. So you have parts of yourself that we call split off parts, parts that are in the unconscious that you don't see, and you see them in others, the good and the bad in others, and you have reactions to them. Okay, that's projection. Projective identification goes farther. Is when we project into somebody a feeling or a sense, and they start to feel it. So this is a really important tool in psychotherapy. Again, I wish that one professor who had firsthand knowledge with it. I probably had to memorize it because it's something that Freud talked about. I probably had to pass a test one time on its definition, but I had no professor who had experience with using it. When I'm having an interact with somebody and I come away scared or angry or depressed, happened last week in my personal life. It gets in me. And I've learned to say, I wonder if that's what the other person was feeling. Were they feeling scared? Were they feeling hopeless? Mom and dad, think about that. Around and in the context of your children, do you feel hopeless and powerless, helpless, sad, out of control? My guess, what projective identification tells us, is that's probably what your child is feeling too. And that's a great first place to join with them. You don't necessarily come back and say, I know you're feeling scared because I'm feeling scared. But in knowing that they're scared, you have a different response to them. It changes you. Projective identification is projecting into somebody and eliciting an emotional response. If you hurt my feelings and I attack you, I want you to feel the hurt that I feel. Simple as that. If I threaten you, I want you to feel threatened because I'm feeling threatened. On and on and on. And most of that process is not conscious. Looking at parenting as a journey and not getting it right or getting in trouble when you are coached, The more work that you do, the more you can understand that you fumble, you flop, you fail, you drop the ball. In fact, you learn as you go along that it's essential to get good at dropping the ball and failing sometimes. And what you do when you experience that failure as an adult, you model for your child for them about how to deal with failure. So if you are guilty of any of the things that I'm talking about tonight, which by the way you are guilty of all of them or some of them, you might have a different style than I do, but you're guilty of these things. It's not to punish you. You don't go. It's not about running away. You'll feel the urge. I told the story a few times about a few months ago when my daughter gave me some. In fact, it happened just the other day again. She gave me some scathing feedback about myself. Probably guess where she learned that from. The propensity to give scathing feedback. You can just take a guess, and I won't confirm or deny it. At any rate, my first instinct is to run away and hide. I said to my wife, I want to go live by myself in the cabins in the mountains so I don't hurt anybody anymore. And as I heard myself utter that to my wife, I knew you're not going anywhere. The way that you're going to do this different from your parents and your father specifically, who did essentially leave, is you're going to stay present. And that's the gift of taking a step toward healing as a father or mother. I love this clinical idea because it's so liberating. Boesky wrote, if the therapist does not get emotionally involved sooner or later in a manner that they had not intended, therapy will not proceed to a successful conclusion. You will mix it up. You will have reactions. You will snap at your child. That's not the end of it. That's not a failure in the big picture. That's a moment for you to model courage. I was going to say humility, but I like the word courage better, although they're the exact same thing in this instance. You model courage and you apologize and you take accountability. And you're starting to create a context where your child learns how to grapple with their own humanity when they hurt people. If nothing else, you can just hear containing is listening. When my daughter was giving me that tough feedback a few months ago that I was referring to earlier, I remember feeling defensive, feeling like she was wrong, feeling like she was exaggerating. And I remember thinking, I'm just going to follow the skill set of listening. I'm just going to do that. And I can go back and defend myself later if I find that that was what was needed. And I listened, and she told me more. And I continued to listen. She left the room, and I told my wife I wanted to go run and hide in the mountains, that whole story. And then I realized that was my stuff. I'm glad I just listened. Clear your mind, reflect back what you're hearing. Wait. If you got a good comeback, give it tomorrow or the next day after your nervous system regulates. Learn to postpone reacting to your instincts. Defensive, justifying, explaining, interpreting, teaching, clarifying, encouraging. Learn to put time in between those. One of the things that they teach prisoners when they are doing psychotherapy with them, a very, very central idea in treating incarcerated people, is to help them create space between stimulus and response. And virtually all of them will tell you that there is virtually no space between the two. So you're going to model this. You're going to evolve. You're going to get larger. You're going to get better as you do this work at pausing. Wait for an hour or a day to send a response text. If it's emotionally charged, wait longer. And there'll be that part of you that feels hurt and small and belittled by whatever was said, that wants to defend itself and feels self-righteous about that defense. But that's all your stuff. That's all your unhealed stuff. Ask for what they want, need, and then decide if you want to do it. Listening to your children doesn't mean you capitulate. In fact, that's a distortion of listening. Ask them if they want a reaction. You can tell your thoughts, perhaps. I would encourage you to strongly consider pausing and not sharing them quickly or right away. My wife and I have learned when she shares a lot of stuff with me, a lot of heavy emotions with me about me or the children or something I have, something that I'm connected to, And she says to me after a long dump, now, what do you think? What are you feeling? I've learned to respond and say, that's not what I'm doing right now. I'll do that tomorrow or the next day. Right now, of course, I didn't agree with everything you said. Of course, I was triggered by the one description and the one example that I thought was exaggerated. But if I go there, you guys know where that goes. And all that is evidence of my lack of wholeness. So I'm just going to wait. I'll defend myself tomorrow. We learn to take a time out for ourselves. We learn that our regulation of our nervous system is our responsibility. That's key. We learn to feel what we are feeling and to own it, to not make it your husband or your wife's or your brother or your sister's or your child's responsibility. Understand what they're feeling. You can feel it in your body, but you can also learn to observe it, to hold it loosely. And ultimately, you're recalibrating what it means to be a good parent. I shared this particular slide. It's in my book, The Audacity to Be You, in a different format, but I talk about safe and unsafe responses to the other. Don't mistake these exact phrases for the words that you use. It's not robotic. It's an energy. The safe responses sound like, thanks for telling me. Tell me more. I appreciate knowing. Glad you told me. Thanks. That sounds hard. I'm sorry. I am here. I'm listening. You're not alone. That makes sense. Is there anything I can do? You must have a good reason. I'd like to understand. What can I do to support you? I can relate. That's what safety sounds like. That's what containing sounds like. That's what facilitating healing sounds like. That's what facilitating self-esteem and growth sounds like. Unsafe responses sound like this. That's silly. You're overreacting. You're too sensitive. You're scaring me. You're being selfish. You should. Don't pay them any mind. They're just jealous. Ignore them. You'll get over it. Look on the bright side. Why did you do that? That's just about emphasis. Have you tried this? I didn't intend that. That wasn't my intention. This behavior, this response, this feeling you're having, that's just your depression, your insecurity, your anxiety, your narcissism, your defense, your rationalization, your justification. People think that's what therapists' jobs are, is just to identify pathology. All you're doing is taking somebody's defense that they've constructed to protect themselves from a threat, and you're just slicing it open. Doesn't work that way. That can work when you know and you trust, and the defense is lowered because you feel safe. So what are the take homes? It's about safety. It's about non-judgment. It's about deconstructing what our culture, what most cultures, what humans are inclined to do. It's about building a secure attachment, which is a resonant and boundaried parent, a parent that can hear and take in the child's distress and reflect back a sense of okayness and still maintain boundaries. That is the key to self-esteem and resilience, which everybody in the world wants to know about these days. Secure attachment based on you doing your work about your childhood, your trauma, your pathology. That's the key to your child's self-esteem and resilience. That's the key to your contribution, I should say, to your child's esteem and resilience. And you will fail at it a trillion times, as will I. And you'll be done when you're done at the end. The minute you take your last breath, you're done. It's very difficult. Somebody in attachments theory, Jessica Benjamin, said this. This is a paraphrase. She said, it's very difficult to find oneself until we are found by somebody else. The root of the self is almost always found through somebody else. When we get heard and seen, look at Fred Rogers. You want to know what I'm talking about, what it looks like in real time? Watch the movies about Fred Rogers. Go back and watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He is the master at what I'm describing. He never tried to get kids to not feel scared or angry. He gave them a safe place to express it in a non-judgmental way. Offering validation and self-discovery for the others is the key to building the sense of esteem and resilience. We want to keep our children away, for example, from the bad friends, from the bad girlfriend or the bad boyfriend. And what we learn is that they have to figure this out. They have to figure out their lives. When they're younger, of course, it's more appropriate to have more rules and limits. But as they get up and grow older, we learn, we expand, we just get larger. Sustained change comes from a place of self understanding and love rather than a place of guilt and shame. Everybody listening who's had any child in therapy, you want to know how to foster, encourage, support long term change, do it away from shame and guilt. Instead of judgment, curiosity. And if you're overwhelmed, and you will be many, many times, go to your support to regulate yourself. Don't ask your child to do it for you. Clear boundaries and containing are not mutually exclusive. In fact, good containers have the clearest of boundaries, period. Absolutely, no doubt about it. Our goal is to promote healing and health and self. And if we do it in a reparative fashion, it's called therapy or psychotherapy. But we can also do it in real time, preventatively. We can do it in our families. You learn to listen to almost anything, not because you should listen, but because you can. See, this is a switch from you should do this to you can do this. That's all the difference in the world. It takes time, and you will fumble and make mistakes, and then there's your opportunity to apologize. As my oldest daughter, my 28-year-old said not too long ago, she said, "Dad, when you failed to listen to some of the things I shared with you that hurt me from childhood, your failure, which I apologized for, was actually a relief. I thought you were going to get it perfect and I was going to doubt myself. But when you fumbled and stumbled and got defensive, it was kind of validating." Now, I didn't do that on purpose. You can't fail on purpose necessarily. It just came to me naturally. All right, I've gone over time, so I'm just going to run through. We'll save questions for next time. My two books, The Audacity to Be You, which is a lot about what I've talked about tonight. Also, The Journey of the Heroic Parent are available on Amazon and Audible. I narrated the second one. We have several new programming coming up. I have a multi-couple intensives. There's one couple spot left if you want to join that. So I'm really looking forward to several couples doing their work together. I'm really, really excited about that. On February 24th, I'm going to have my third Conscious Parenting Workshop, 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. If you want to sign up for that, contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. Excuse me. I'm teaching a masterclass on attachment-based therapy. So I'm going to use all the technical stuff and all the language. It's going to be a full day, 6 CEU credits for you. So if you need credits, if you're a professional, that's great. People have asked me if it's okay for parents to come or people that aren't therapists. It is, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time translating it for you. I'm going to be talking about and towards the therapeutic experience. Of course, I'll make some comparisons, but you'll have to do your own. You'll have to do your own translation of attachment-based therapy into parenting or coaching or leading a team at work. You'll have to do that yourself. And then on June 23rd through 25th, I'm going to be doing a Finding You weekend in New York. We just announced it. We already have 2 people committed. It will fill up. So if you're listening to me over in the UK, contact Intensives at Evoke Therapy soon because it's going to fill up. I'm sure of it. It'll fill up months in advance. That, I think, is June. Did I say that right? June. I'll be in the UK, June 23rd through 25th. For your next opportunity to do a Finding You workshop here in Utah, February 22nd through the 26th is your next offering in person. The best way to do the work that I've described tonight, and the best place, I think, to experience containing. A lot of intensives and psychoeducational programs don't value containing like Evoke therapists do. We also have an online offering. I talked about that last week or the other day at length. We have an online offering that's a third of the cost, and you don't have to travel. So it's a way to save time and money. It's half the time of Finding You. So January 27th through 29th, and you get a lot of the benefits coming up. Intensives at Evoke Therapy to find out more. We also have custom Finding Connection for couples and Finding Family for families that you can talk to our admissions folks about. We have support groups for current wilderness families and alumni. The next offering is January 19th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have an alumni only, wilderness alumni only meeting. January 24th is the next offering for that, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And then for our intensives, we have one a month. January 10th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time is the next offering. If you have any questions, you can go to our website or contact intensives at webinar. Oh, that says I wrote that wrong. It's not intensives at webinar.com. It's intensives at evoketherapy.com. It's a funny typo. I already mentioned coaching. You want individual couples coaching, parent coaching. We also have pursuits trips, 3 to 30-day customized adventure trips for families and adults. Think therapy light or sober fun. We ask all current parents of our wilderness clients to attend 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA.org, familiesanonymous.org, or adultchildren.org. Also, refugerecovery.org and NAMI.org offer free classes and resources in your local community. All of these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast, and you'll find them there. You can also listen to them on soundcloud.com on your computer by searching the same name, or go to Evoke's YouTube channel and listen there. You can find Evoke Therapy Programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can also find Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And also our blog has new content very often throughout the month. If you want to give back to people, for people that can't afford treatment, our 3 charitable partners are choosementalhealth.org, sky'sthelimitfund.org, or evokefamilyfoundation.org. You can, with all of those organizations, you can earmark your funds to be used for Evoke if you want to give back to somebody to have an Evoke experience. All right, folks, thank you for joining me. On behalf of the people that love you, thank you for being willing to do your work. I hope this is a helpful point of contact for you. And my next broadcast will be this Tuesday, January 10th at 6:30 p.m. It'll be a live Q&A. Any leftover questions from this evening or any questions that you, your family, friends, the siblings want to bring to me, I'm happy to answer on that broadcast. So I'll talk to you next Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. All right, folks. Thanks for joining me this evening. Have a great evening. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.